Show me the money.
Hey, it's me. Knock, knock. So, you got my money?
Think about it. You're dealing with numbers all day long. Decimal points, high frequencies, bang, bang, bang. Digits, all very acidic, above the shoulders mustard shit. Right? Kind of wig some people out. Right? You gotta feed the geese to keep the blood flowing. Now keep the rhythm below the belt.
I want to stay in Arizona. I want my new contract. Show me the money! Jerry, you better yell! Show me the money!
Where's my money? You gonna give me my money? Where's my money, man?
Welcome back to Cap Strapped. I'm Max Dean, and you can find me on Twitter at PanAmFootball. Today we're going to be looking at the Houston Texans salary cap situation as one of the final parts of our Divisional Deep Dive AFC South week. If you like what you see, throw a like my way. I do appreciate it. It helps, and I'll be doing this for every single NFL team in the league. So hit subscribe if your team is coming up or you just love salary cap. Now, the Houston Texans, we've talked about it in the draft analytic video, tough situation. They're under the rookie phase of their rebuild. So they have less than 2 drafts done. So not enough time to really look at what the new regime wants to do. You know, they're getting out from under contracts that were signed by the previous regime. They haven't had enough drafts to bring in their own players in. So just keep that in mind as we look through this. But you'll still be able to see a pretty interesting trend that they've started here. Now, before I start to talk about it, let's just bring it up here. So I don't want to rehash myself too much because some of you guys will watch a lot of these. But basically, a few things that you can see here. You can see the cap hits for the top 51 players. That also includes draft picks from this year, because it's pretty unlikely that draft picks from this year will be released. It's possible, it happens, but it's not super common. So I always include those in my top 51 projections. You also get APY for every single player. So case in point, Deshaun Watson has a cap hit of $15.9 million, but he has an APY of $39 million. So you get to see a differential there. There are other players who have a pretty substantial one. For example, Laramie Tunsil, he only has a $9.29 million cap hit, whereas his APY is $22 million. And there are a couple of ways that you get there, and I'll talk about each of them along the way. When you look at the positional breakdown, they don't have a huge investment on the cap at any one position, but they also have a good chunk of dead money, which I'll talk about in a minute. So they've had to keep cap hits low even for players with high APY. And then the final thing that's really interesting here is because their salary cap situation was pretty tough and they wanted to bring in a lot of new players, instead of bringing in like a few guys who are making in that $7, $6, $8 million range, they didn't really do much of that. They just brought in a ton of guys who are making that between $1 and $2 million range. So if you saw on the Colts, there was a big range right around here where guys were making, around $1.5 million, and they were all second and third round picks. But here you can see a lot of these guys were 1-year contracts that are for basically vets who haven't done a whole lot elsewhere, just to round out the roster. Because otherwise, all you could afford to do was sign a bunch of guys for the veteran minimum. So they elected to go a little less heavy up top and more mediocre in the middle. And they didn't have the draft capital to try and trade down and accumulate a bunch of second and third round picks. They didn't have it. The other thing, and you'll see differences with all of these teams. With the Colts, down here where you ended up getting into the 2021 draft picks, you got around to the approximately $920,000 range for cap hits. Sometimes you'll see it even lower, but this is actually unusually high. Before you break into the cap hits for the Texans, the lowest cap hit is $1.3 million. And again, the reason for that is just because they signed so many guys in that $1.5 million range. So, they are an extensively, very lower end of middle structured roster. And then again, you got a couple of really highly paid guys just that have lower cap hits this year. So one of the reasons I love this graphic here is because it shows the stark difference in what a team uses in their salary cap versus what their total APY is. If you look at all the salary cap for all the different teams in the league, it's hard to really see what the difference is in terms of their team situation. Like, you might have a whole bunch of teams who have spent around $175 million on the cap. But if you look at the total APY, it just tells such a different story for what's coming in their future. So the Houston Texans, $175 million on the cap in terms of usage for players. They also have $7.1 million in dead cap, around 7.2 or so. But then their total APY is $241,500,000. So there's a huge differential here. In fact, I think it's by far the biggest I've come across as of yet. A chunk of that comes from Deshaun Watson, because he does have that $15.9 million cap hit versus a $39 million APY. Now, they signed him to an extension last offseason. So what they could have done is increase his cap hit in the first couple of years to bring down the future APY. So the differential, the future APY would be, the APY would be the same because of the way that it's negotiated in the contract. However, in terms of the salary cap effect, the differential between cap hit this year and APY would not be so substantial. However, even if you discount the Deshaun Watson factor, they still have a differential of $43.4 million, which at this point is still the largest differential I've come across. Again, even with Deshaun Watson out of the picture. So they are a team that is just future loaded as possible. And I think they had no choice, because they had a couple of very expensive players, a bit of dead money, and just a total lack of talent. So they had to bring in so many guys that were inexpensive, but to get all of those guys under contract, they had to push money to the future for some. And Deshaun Watson already had his money in the future anyway. So this chart just shows how the team has structured their offense versus defense versus special teams versus dead cap. They're about as even as it gets. Basically equal spending on offense and defense for all intents and purposes. And, their special teams and dead cap are basically equal as well. So the takeaway from this is that with all of the expensive offensive players that they have, they've lowered the cap hits of those players, or kept them low before, and signed a ton of mid-level defensive guys. So basically they have quality on offense in terms of the top-end players with lowered cap hits and volume on the defensive side of the ball, which basically brings them to just about equal. So again, this graphic, it tells you how the team has structured their roster. How many players do they have that are paid like elite players? And then comparatively, how many players have an elite level salary cap hit? How many players are paid like mid-level players and have a mid-level salary cap hit, and then lower level, etc. So I don't want to necessarily go through this every video, but maybe I just should. 30 plus million, that is franchise quarterback money. 20 to 29.9 million, elite money for premium positions. Cornerback, offensive tackle, defensive tackle, edge rusher, wide receiver. Then $10 to $19.9 million. That's elite money for non-premium positions and very good money for premium positions. Then 5 to 9.9. Those are high-end veterans and very high first-round draft picks. $2 to $4.9 million. Those are kind of lower-end vets, lower middle-end vets, and late first-round picks, and then minimum, so 1.9 or lower. That's anywhere from veteran minimum players to second-round picks and lower. So with the Colts, we saw high investment in that minimum, so 1.9 million or less. And those were mostly built on second round and later draft picks. Here with the Texans, we're seeing something very different. We are seeing a heavy investment on the $2 to $4.9 million range. And those are all middle to lower middle end veteran players. And so again, that's volume versus quality. They also have a good chunk of very expensive players, and that doesn't translate from APY to cap number. So if you look at APY, you've got a player in the $30 million range, you got a player in the $20 million range, then you got 5 players in the $10 million to $19.9 million range. And if you translate that over to actual cap number, they've only got 3 players up there. And that's because they've had to push so much money to the future for these guys that their cap hit doesn't reflect their APY at all. So now we're going to talk about some interesting contracts on the Texans. We did this for the Colts too, and again, interesting can come about in any number of different ways. So there is no player that is more interesting from a contract perspective than Deshaun Watson on the Texans. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what his numerical situation is. I'm not going to dwell on any of the other stuff. Deshaun Watson was a 2017 first-round pick, which means his 5th-year option ran through the 2021 league year. So, his extension years don't even start until 2022. When looking at this, his potential dead money, which is only based on what it would be if he was released before that season, so you can basically throw that $67 million out the window. It's not going to happen. He's not going to be released. So what I'm going to do is show you a couple of possibilities of what the Texans would be on the hook for if he were traded at different times. What his guarantees are, which is basically what the dead money is a result of, would be his salary in 2021, his salary in 2022, and the prorated bonus that he was already paid. So if he were to be traded right now, all salary, guaranteed or otherwise, would move on to the new team. So the Texans would only be on the hook for the prorated bonus. Now, because it's after June 2nd, or because it's June 2nd or later, only the 2021 hit affects this year, and the 16.2 from the total of 2022, 2023, and 2024 would hit next year. That's how a June 2nd release or trade works. However, because of his situation, it's extremely unlikely that he would be traded prior to the season. So let's look at a more likely outcome. So if Deshaun Watson's legal situation is not figured out prior to the regular season this year, the most likely outcome would probably be that he were to be placed on the commissioner's exempt list. Now, that means that he would still get paid. He would still be owed his $10.5 million salary. So his cap hit wouldn't change for this year. So let's assume that that were to happen. Watson were to be placed on the commissioner's exempt list, and then let's say next year, once this is sorted out, he ends up getting traded to a new team. Let's see what that would look like. So not wildly different. The main difference is that the Texans would be on the hook for that $10.5 million this year. They would also have his prorated bonus hit this year, so he would have a $15.94 million cap hit, and that would be no different than what it would have been if he played, except that you're basically paying for that for a guy to just not be there. Then, when he was traded next offseason, all future salary would be pushed to the new team, and the Texans would get hit with that $16.2 million dead money hit, again, which comes from the prorated bonus of 2022, 2023, 2024. I can't stress it enough. That money has already been paid to him in the past. He's not being paid not to be there. He's already been paid, and they just decided to take it as a future salary cap hit. Now, when they did it, they didn't think it was all going to come 1 year, but whatever. So as far as the team, obviously he's the highest paid per year on his own team. And as far as NFL APY rank, he is third overall in quarterbacks with $39 million per year. So Laramie Tunsil is another really interesting contract for the Texans. They signed him to a large extension last year after trading 2 first-round picks for him the year before that. This is a very player-friendly contract for a couple of reasons. One, the length of the contract. Only 3 years. That means that he only has 2 years left before he can start talking about an extension, which is very standard practice. Doing it with a year left is very normal. Or he'd be able to hit free agency very early in his career for a first-round offensive tackle hitting his 3rd contract. It's not normal. Then on top of that, the APY is high. It was best in the NFL at the time of signing, but also because it's pretty front-loaded in terms of he got his money quite quickly. It's a little backloaded in terms of cap hits because of what the Texans have had to do, but in terms of when he gets his money, it's early. So it was a 3-year, $66 million contract. So let's say $66 million, and then we're going to subtract the $18.5 million base salary. That means he's earned $23.75 million in the first 2 years of the extension year. So he's earned well more than his APY by the time he's actually coming around for another extension. Oftentimes, you're looking at a little bit lower than the APY by the time you get to the extension. And then, because the extension is going to be higher anyway, the team is okay with that. It's just not a good look for the Texans. And I know Texans fans are probably not happy with me, but to be honest, you should just be unhappy with your own team, not me. So Tunsil comes in at second on his team behind Deshaun Watson. And then he comes in second in the NFL for tackles at $22 million per year. You'll probably see him ranked at 3rd in different lists for salary cap sites, but to me, he's second. And I know people, they can disagree with me. It's fine, but the reason that I look at it this way is because they have Trent Williams at number 1. And for me, Trent Williams is actually number 3. And I look at it this way for players like Alvin Kamara or whoever. Anytime a player has a year at the end of their contract, which is just exorbitantly high, so high that a player would never play under that year, and it's there just to artificially raise the APY, I just don't include it. So Trent Williams, his average per year without his final year is 19.1. If you include that final year, it's 30-some million. And so basically, that just raises his average per year $2 million for every year. So $4 million for every year, I guess that would be actually, because it jumps him up to 23.1, I guess. And so it jumps his entire APY up so substantially that it makes it look like he's the most well compensated when in fact he's not. So I don't factor that in. I think it's important to rank these players how they're actually valued by their own team or the league. And so that just means that Tunsil is number 2 in the NFL. So that's it for the Texans today. Let me know if you liked what you've seen. And again, if you have any questions about the Texans that I didn't answer, hit me up on Twitter. I'll be happy to interact. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have or comment right here on the YouTube video. And if you have questions that you want me to answer for upcoming salary cap videos for other teams, let me know so that I can include it in the video while I'm making these. I appreciate you guys hanging out, and I will see you all soon with the rest of the AFC South.